Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk about your theoretical framework in the dissertation. We're going to clearly define what the theoretical framework is, the difference between the theoretical framework and the conceptual framework, as well as how to use the theoretical framework to shape your dissertation, including your research question, your literature review, and your findings and recommendations. So first, let's start with an understanding of what we mean by the theoretical framework. What you want to do is you want to find a single theory or a collection of theory, let's say 2, 3 interrelated theories or concepts that you can hang your dissertation upon. For example, let's say hypothetically that you're looking into the self-efficacy of teachers that are in training in your EDAS program. If you want to look at self-efficacy, that means Bandira, which means socio-cognitive learning theory, and it means the motivation theories in research, because self-efficacy is a theory of motivation. Now, oftentimes people will link self-efficacy with identity theory constructs. So you could perhaps look into the identity theory literature as well and interrelate socio-cognitive with identity. And that's would give you a theoretical framework for your dissertation, just as one example. So what you want to do from there is you want to look into an existing theory or as well as scholarly literature that will inform your study. Everything in your study should be informed by the theoretical framework that you've chosen. It basically is the way in which you construct your dissertation. It's like the framework for your house, right? If you don't have a good, strong framework, your house will collapse. So your framework must show that you understand relevant connections within your study as well as the larger body of literature. So the first thing you want to do is you want to look into background information for your research. Remember, like I've said in a previous presentation that I hope you've watched, you want to do your chapter 2, your lit review for your dissertation, as you are constructing your chapter 1 as well. It would be very hard to have a strong chapter 1 for your dissertation if you don't have an understanding of the literature relevant for what you're wanting to study. Same thing for the theoretical framework. It would be frankly impossible to have a strong theoretical framework if you don't understand the background literature. You can only discuss background information if you know and understand the background. That's common sense, but too often I will see doctoral students try to put together a theoretical framework as well as a chapter 1 without thoroughly investigating the literature, and that's where we run into some issues. So again, you need to read the literature thoroughly in an ongoing way, iteratively, throughout your dissertation process. And so, some questions that you want to ask as you're thinking about your theoretical framework. What is the study of interest that you're going to be looking into? What's the foundation for the problems that lead to the study? What causes your dissertation to be important, right? So for EDAS, what problems within administration or leadership do you want to look into? What are some areas where we might not know enough? What are some overall larger context of scholarly literature related to your study that can inform your dissertation? And think about your target audience, right? Like, obviously, your target audience would include your committee, obviously, but what implications are you hoping to find that will interest certain people? Are you going to be targeting principals? Are you going to be targeting district administrators? Are you going to be targeting a certain group of researchers within the field? That informs your dissertation too. So from there, we look into the purpose of the study, what is the need for the study, what's the research question, what are your anticipated findings, as well as what is the significance of the study. All of this is informed by your framework that you choose. And this, in turn, also informs what framework is appropriate. It's this cyclical process. Now, some background here. I'm going to discuss a great deal that's appropriate for EDAS, but I'm also going to use some terms that are appropriate for literacy and reading because I really want this video that I'm making to be useful and appropriate for both reading PhD people as well as for EDAS PhD people. Hopefully, you can go along with that. And in many times, there might be an interconnection that can be made. For instance, in the field of reading, there's a great deal of debate going on over how to teach phonics and whether to use the what's called the simple view of reading versus social constructivist views of reading. In EDAS, you don't necessarily need to know all about that, but the findings and the implications and which path you choose can affect administration too. It can definitely impact your decisions as, let's say, a principal. And so that could be an interlinking way that, in which you look into it. So remember, your theoretical framework is going to inform all of these things. If your purpose is not tied to your framework, then that means you're going to either need to redo your purpose or you're going to redo your framework or vice versa. Too many times I've seen students come to me with dissertation ideas and they have an idea for a research question, but it's not linked, it's not related to their framework. For instance, maybe they're asking a research question that is social-cognitive, Bandura, self-efficacy, for instance. But the framework that they've kind of pre-written before they've even met with me might be social constructivist, Vygotsky. Well, the two haven't been linked, and so therefore we need to work a little bit on this. So we get deeper here into understanding the theoretical framework. The theoretical framework is an underlying theory or collection of theories, you might have two, three, interwoven, interconnected, that guides your study. For instance, let's say we're talking about Vygotsky. Oftentimes Vygotsky and social constructivist theories will guide a dissertation. But oftentimes, within that overall umbrella of social constructivism, you might have cognitive constructivism with Piaget linked in with Vygotsky. Now, there are some similarities and differences between Vygotsky's ideas and Piaget's ideas, right? Vygotsky emphasized more the social, the cultural, historical, and Piaget was more the internal, the cognitive. And so if we're going to link these two, you've got to do some comparing and contrasting if you're going to have that as your theoretical framework. So again, you can use two different ones. You can use, for instance, Vygotsky and Piaget, but you've got to do some comparing and contrasting as well as some linkages there. Again, this theoretical framework informs your statement of the problem as well as your rationale for your study. It should inform your research question as well as your anticipated findings in this cyclical way. And of course, your theoretical framework and your methods should be consistent as well. Your theoretical framework should very much frame your study. Hence, it's called a framework, right? It's a framework for a study that provides guidance toward what questions you're going to ask. It guides your literature review as well as what methods are appropriate, as well as your interpretation of findings. Remember, you're using this framework as your lens for how you're going to do the study. So, for instance, if you're doing social constructivism informed by Vygotsky, you're looking at the social interactions. You're looking at the activity system, for instance, perhaps, if you're doing cultural historical activity theory. So within this activity system, in all of your research questions, your lenses that you're using are consistent with looking at what activity system is taking place, how are people interacting within this activity system, guided by perhaps activity theory. So you're guided by that. You would not want to ask a research question that's inconsistent with activity theory if activity theory is your framework. So your theoretical framework explains the meaning, the nature, as well as challenges associated with what you're studying. People that are informed by, let's say, Dewey's understanding of reflective thinking will understand the reflective thinking process a little bit differently than people that are informed by, let's say, Paulo Freire or Mazzero. The theory explains and helps you understand what you're going to be looking into and how you're going to look into it and what you expect to find. It provides framing. It's like the structure of the house, the framing for the house that you're going to make. You introduce what you're going to study and you explain and explore what you're going to be studying using that theoretical framework as your lens. So some keys here. You want to be very explicit, very clear about what theory is guiding your study. Don't be vague. You need to connect everything in your dissertation to your theoretical framework, and you can need to connect that theoretical framework to a larger body of knowledge. For instance, let's say you're doing social cognitive with Bandura and self-efficacy. You need to show that you're connecting the larger body of knowledge within the sociocognitive literature to your dissertation. And again, everything that you're anticipating to find is informed by the way that you look at this data and the way that you look at this problem, informed by this framework. It's like a pair of glasses that you put on and you see through these glasses. That's another way of looking at it. The glasses that you wear inform how you see the world. So a good theoretical framework will support the analysis in a very thoughtful and informative way. Your analysis should be consistent with that framework. Um, Qualitative and quantitative dissertations turn out differently, right? So it provides a lens for the interpretation of your results, and it provides a lens for explaining the relevance of these results to the larger body of literature and the larger field that you're discussing. And it leads to the achievement of specific goals within your dissertation. So the focus of framework, it helps you really focus on what are you investigating as well as why are you investigating it, the rationale for why you're investigating something. It helps you make connections to existing knowledge, and it should provide you with guidance for how to connect theory with your specific study, as well as your methods. So remember, from there we get into concepts. Like I said on a previous video, the zone of proximal development, for instance, that difference between what a learner can do independently and what a learner can do with guidance, that's not a theory, that's a concept that comes out of social cultural learning theories under Vygotsky. So think of concepts as ideas that are consistent and stem from theories. So many concepts can be defined in different ways depending on which theoretical framework is used. For instance, let's take reflective thinking. For a Deweyan point of view, which is consistent with, let's say, David Kemper's way of looking at reflective thinking and Donald Schoen's way of looking at reflective thinking, you're talking about growth over time. You're talking about open-mindedness to new ideas, and you're looking at different ways of understanding concepts based upon new frameworks, based upon new evidence. That's a Deweyan way of looking at it. Now, a critical way of looking at it based upon critical theory includes everything I just said, but it also privileges the idea of looking at the haves and the have-nots, who is oppressed versus who is not oppressed, who has voice versus who does not have voice, that sort of thing. And that's consistent with Paulo Freire as well as Jacques Mazzero. So remember, depending on which framework you're using, a concept like reflective thinking might take on different ideas within the literacy field, depending on which framework we're using to define and understand processes of how children read, that's going to impact different definitions that we might want to use for things like fluency or comprehension. And that gets into huge debates, but you need to be consistent. It's not a small thing to identify the theoretical framework. So, your conceptual framework, remember, there is a difference between a theoretical framework and a conceptual framework. Theoretical framework focuses on theory or series of theories interrelated. Conceptual framework focuses on a particular concept or group of concepts. So that's the key difference. When we talk about a conceptual framework, it's what concept or concepts guide your study. The understanding and defining of concepts is informed by your theoretical framework. So the two are interrelated. Sometimes in dissertations, you might have a conceptual framework that is spelled out very explicitly, and the theoretical framework is pretty much implicit, and the theoretical framework is kind of woven into chapter 2 within the literature review within chapter 2, but the conceptual framework is more explicitly spelled out within a section. That's between you and the committee, as well as the nature of your dissertation. Some dissertations call for the theoretical framework to be very explicitly spelled out. Some dissertations call for the conceptual framework to be very explicitly spelled out. That basically depends if your dissertation is very much theory based, if it's theoretical and exploring theory and exploring the nature of theory to practice, you need to explicitly spell out your theoretical framework. If your theory is very concept driven, for instance, exploring the way that zone of proximal development, the way that learning takes place within a zone of proximal development among a group of teachers, something like that. If it's very conceptual based, then you would need to very explicitly spell out your conceptual framework, and you might weave the theoretical framework within chapter 2. So the main difference between a theoretical and conceptual framework is as follows. The conceptual framework demonstrates relationships among concepts and ideas, whereas the theoretical framework is focused on a single theory or a group of theories and how that relates to your study. So we come to the choice of which do you need to spell out very explicitly within a section of your dissertation. Do you need to spell out the theoretical or the conceptual framework? Again, is your dissertation more related to connecting theory to practice or ideas and concepts to practice? That's the key question you need to be asking. Generally speaking, if you use a theoretical framework in a qualitative research or quantitative research, you need to determine which specific theories you are intending to use or theory. Most types of theoretical frameworks and research are based upon existing theories. You don't have to create a new theory, and in fact, um, and you can do a grounded study. It's possible to do a grounded study, but it's rare in dissertations to do too many grounded studies. That gets complicated. For instance, you might use socio-cognitive framework when you're investigating self-efficacy and link that into the broader area of motivation theory if you're doing that. So on the other hand, a conceptual framework is ideal for something you will develop based upon theory. So if you're developing an idea, then you might really want to explore the conceptual framework to explore that idea. So you develop a conceptual framework if you're trying to find a particular solution based upon a particular idea and you really focus on a particular concept. So remember, let's not confuse the two. Conceptual framework, think of concepts and ideas. Theoretical framework, think of theories. And the conceptual framework grows out of the theoretical framework. You must be very clear on the difference between the two. So again, we think of the difference. Is your dissertation theory driven or concept-driven. If it's concept-driven, then you want to focus on clearly spelling out your conceptual framework. Oftentimes, conceptual framework is commonly used in qualitative research when the focus is on key conceptual ideas. But it is possible to use the theoretical framework in qualitative research too. Oftentimes, the theoretical framework is used in quantitative research. But again, that's not hard and fast. It's not a rule. So typically when I work with a dissertation, how long does this explanation be? Generally aim for about 4 to 5 pages within chapter 1 for your spelling out of your theoretical or conceptual framework. A good chapter 1 really should have it well spelled out. When it comes down to the structure of the dissertation, and this is something that can kind of confuse doctoral students sometimes because you don't necessarily see much of a discussion about a theoretical framework or a conceptual framework necessarily in all that many journal articles or journal chapters, or if you do, it's a brief discussion, right? Remember, journal articles, peer-reviewed journal articles have space limitations. Oftentimes when you're writing an article, you will basically integrate the framework within your discussion of the literature. And if you read that literature discussion and the article carefully enough, the framework is very clear and it's very explicitly spelled out, but they may not have a dissertation style section saying this is my framework. That's fairly common in many journal articles. But when you're looking for guidance in a dissertation, that can possibly confuse you. When you're writing your dissertation, I would really recommend having about a 4 to 5 page, sometimes less, sometimes more, section on the theoretical framework within chapter 1. And then remember, everything in your dissertation must be consistent with that framework. And there's from there, in terms of consistency, there's various ways of keeping consistent. For instance, section headers might help you to stay consistent. So then, as we go toward a little bit of closing on here, we look at how do you write the framework, that little section within chapter 1. You might want to start by identifying the main theory or concept. If you're doing conceptual framework, theory if you're doing theoretical framework. Identify the main theories that inform your dissertation. Start by picking main terms in your research problem and research question, and your understanding of these terms will help guide you toward your framework. Some concepts can have different definitions. For instance, like I was just talking about, our definition of fluency or our definition of explicit phonics, or which phonics system we want to use, or our definition of comprehension, or our definition of reflective thinking. It really depends on which theoretical framework we're using to define that. So it's very, very important to define terms consistently with your framework. So you want to explain relevant theories. You want to define the connections between your theories and concepts as understood in the wider body of literature. You want to evaluate different approaches and compare and contrast them as relevant to your dissertation study within this little section that you've got in chapter 1. And finally, within that section in chapter 1 where you describe your theoretical framework, you want to establish the most appropriate definition for terms within the research literature after discussing the theoretical model that you're using. Your theoretical framework gets you very much into the why. Your theoretical framework basically in many ways is the why in connection with your problem statement. So you explain why you chose this particular theory for your study. Why is this particular theory the most suitable one for your particular purpose? And suitability is everything, right? Best fit. For those of you that are in EDAS, I'm sure you know the quality assurance literature. This fits with dissertations too, right? Fitness of purpose. And of course, as we get toward the end here, the theoretical framework very much informs your hypothesis that you're making in the study. What do you expect to find? What do you expect to discover in your dissertation? Well, your expected findings should be consistent and informed by the lens that you're using within that theoretical framework. So hopefully this was helpful. Feel free to reach out to me anytime as you continue to shape and reshape your dissertation as well as your theoretical framework. Take care.